So welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Max. I'm one of the co-founders of Signific. Been working at different companies within data product, currently at Soundtrap. If you go to the next one, just briefly before we get started about us at Signific, we're a consultancy in Stockholm. We help companies learn faster than their competitors by getting more value from their data, experimentation, and machine learning. So essentially what we help companies with is improving their product analytics and experimentation capabilities to work data-driven. We help build modern data platforms to democratize their data, and also to the topic of today, perhaps creating value from machine learning and data science. Some practicalities around this webinar and the topic of EU AI Act. This is not legal advice, just wanted to point that out. But with that said as well, feel free to post questions in the chat and we can pick them up at the end of the webinar.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Max. Really great to be here. And thank you everyone for coming in to joining the webinar. Really hope you get a lot out from this. I'll give you a really brief intro into who I am before we get started. So basically, I've been a data scientist for over 3 years and worked specifically in pharma and life sciences sector, and basically came to a kind of crossroads in my career, and it had two choices really. One was to just be a goblin and just create AI just because, the kind of Wild West AI approach, or do I become an enlightened data scientist, this kind of Yoda that creates value with AI, but also communicates commercial as well as societal value with these technologies. Without further ado, we're going to go straight into the content, and basically we're going to ask the kind of fundamental question: why should I even bother knowing about AI legislation? Hopefully, once I've convinced you of that fact, we're going to then move on to the EU AI Act itself, talking about the different obligations. And then after that, the juicier part of this webinar is then going to be talking about the actionable steps as AI professionals. We'll firstly, though, start with a poll. So Max, can we get this one up to then basically ask everyone, how much do you know about the EU AI Act in the context of your organization? That's okay. So good. Okay. Nice. All right. So we're seeing at the moment that overall, the EU Act is a relatively new topic for most people, which is great. You've come to the right place for that. So that'll be really good. So we know about upcoming obligations. That's great. I think then the next bit, which hopefully will be really insightful from this presentation for you guys who have answered that, we'll see towards the very end of how we can implement on those obligations and start to do that. Fab. Then we'll move on. Thank you very much for answering then the question, everyone. We'll move on to then the most important question, which is then, why do we bother about AI law? And I kind of break it into kind of 3 levels, right? We have firstly the human level, right? I typically ask this question to people and say, okay, raise your hand if you want people to feel unsafe, or you want people to be unhealthy or unwell, or you want to take away people's fundamental rights. Obviously, I don't think we're going to see any hands up on that topic. So as a responsibility as developers, we have a responsibility when creating these technologies and deploying it into the real world and the impacts that it will have. And then building on top of that human angle, we then got the kind of professional perspective, which is then about improving your code of practice, right? And driving innovation. But I think most importantly, the point here is about creating a common language between technical and commercial teams, which at the moment are working relatively in silos. So using compliance as a kind of communication point between the two sides will really spark a collaboration and collaboration around innovation. And I think then finally, the contribution towards the organization that you're working towards is then about value creation, right? So it's about helping organizations to have some clarity about this changing AI landscape, right? We're seeing some legislation coming in from the US, for example. So it's again about understanding how these things are changing over time and how do we monitor that. But also, again, more importantly, is to avoid regulatory fines, right? The less amount of regulatory fines, the chance it's going to go into your pocket instead. To expand on that kind of value creation point, right, as a clarity point, we've kind of seen part of it from this poll, but we see a few enlightening statistics about essentially organizations who still need some help in understanding this, and still taken from a relatively recent-ish survey, that they still need some help to guide them through this. And then coming on to the fines part, it's in a similar ballpark from what we're seeing with GDPR, right? Where we're seeing quite significant fines, but again, these depend on the severity of the infringement and the size of the organization. So hopefully, with those few slides, I've kind of at least semi-convinced you that we should care about knowing about AI legislation. Let's move on to the iconic piece that has been recently published in August, then the EU AI Act. And so the EU Act is basically one of the first pieces of legislation that is directly focused on artificial intelligence. And it focuses really on the level of risk on someone's health, safety, and fundamental rights. And we'll see this as a kind of ongoing piece later on with the risk classification part. But here to also give you a kind of like timeline of how it's kind of come from inception to where it is. The EU Act itself focuses on this specific scope, so how an AI system is defined for those people who aren't as good, who love a kind of visual diagram. I've put it here of how it's defined. So basically taking an input, going into a machine-based system through adaptiveness, training, etc., then generating outputs and predictions, which then influence our decisions. The EU AI Act itself is composed of kind of different pieces of the puzzle. So we have mainly the risk classification part, which mainly focuses on high and unacceptable risk and what you do about them. And as well, on top of that, there's two other bits. There's one about transparency obligations, which come a little bit separately, which is a little bit of a misconception, but it's deemed as a separate piece. And then on top of that, there's also a separate section about general purpose AI, or kind of generative AI in that sense as well, will be within that scope. But first, we'll talk about the risk classification of this. So how it works is it works on this AI risk hierarchy, I call it. So external to the EU AI Act, the Commission has defined these kind of different levels from minimal all the way to unacceptable, and it increases from the risk to someone's health, safety, and fundamental rights, right? Very similar to what we've been talking about. So here, the slide just gives you like a kind of few examples about what these aspects cover. There's a few that are still in a little bit of a gray zone, but we'll talk about how more clarity will be added on later from the AI office. So the next question we might ask ourselves is, okay, we know about this risk hierarchy. How do we then classify our AI systems, right? So the framework that we're going to show you today is basically, firstly, it's based on your own organization's judgment on the risk level. But then you might think further, okay, how do we justify the level that it's on? The framework that we're going to show you here is basically, the goal is to start from the highest risk and justify your way down as a way of, again, saving the legal debate, such that you are then maintaining high levels of compliance instead of going from bottom up. So it's always erring then on the side of caution. So then we might then ask ourselves, okay, we have these risk levels, and then we now want to categorize it and now justify it. How do we justify it? Well, the key is very simple. We break it into four distinct points. We evaluate the risk to health, the risk to safety, the risk to fundamental rights, and also quite an important one is about the balance between human and AI control. So when we talk about health and evaluating health, we should be asking questions along the lines of the following, right? Does the AI system have an impact on health outcomes? Or will the development of that AI system impact communities? Because we also have to take into account the high levels of water usage and land usage that data centers use as part of cooling down these servers in order to run inference on our AI models. When it comes to safety, we need to think about aspects like, how do we treat personal data? So there's been a few instances where, with ChatGPT 2, for instance, where personal data was actually regurgitated from a system, from a given prompt. So we need to also think about how does privacy keep intact with the use of and the deployment of these AI models. And also another important question is about, are these AI systems likely to be attacked? So for example, if these systems are going to be used in a bank, maybe they're more likely to be attacked than those in maybe an education setting. When we then talk about fundamental rights, I've only just taken really a subsection of the fundamental rights that are taken from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which could be semi-implicated by AI systems. But essentially the point of this is just to look at how are these AI systems affecting or could potentially have an impact on our fundamental rights. And then finally, human versus AI control. And so basically it talks about how the AI system fits in the context of the decision-making process. Is the AI system then helping and augmenting a decision from a human to then be executed? Or is the AI system going to generate the prediction and then also act on that decision? And so overall, it comes into this nice kind of little tabular format here, where we have basically with health, safety, and fundamental rights, we can attribute a kind of risk level to that. And it's again up to the organization how they determine that risk level. And then when it comes to human versus AI control, I've just looked at two key aspects. Who is the decision maker and who has the impact? And how has the AI got the impact on that decision maker? And so using all these ideas gives you a general overview of what risk level we should attribute to it. And so essentially this is how the kind of justification process works, just by looking through health, safety, fundamental rights, human versus AI control, and that helps you to understand at least where you should be placed on this risk hierarchy. And so now, hopefully with that, we have a better understanding of how we do this risk classification. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it up to you, put it to the test and see how it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a series of use cases for AI, and I want you to basically choose the risk level from unacceptable all the way down to minimal. So here's the first case. We take an AI system that is used to provide a risk score in immigration applications. Select the level that you think is most appropriate for this system. We're seeing people definitely looking more towards the high risk. That's really good to see. I've put it as a high risk system, but again, feel free to argue for unacceptable for sure, definitely. But basically, my decision making came down to the following: how much would it affect someone's health? Maybe minimal. In terms of safety, I know that there's one example where a system was used in the UK government to help assess asylum seekers' use of English language. And basically their software, their AI model to detect cheating as part of their test, was actually producing a lot of false positives. So meaning it was basically saying that people were cheating when they weren't. And what that led to was actually a few thousand asylum seekers actually getting deported from the country and maybe going back into relatively unsafe environments, right? In terms of fundamental rights, again, it's about maybe equal protection against discrimination, for instance, or equal access to public service. Those sorts of things maybe would contribute to that. But really good to see that people are talking along the high and unacceptable range. Definitely there's some room with that. Let's have a look at the second case. So the second case is about a customer service chatbot for an airline company. What do we think about this one? Let's think about health, safety, fundamental rights, and human versus AI control. Seems like there's some alignment around the limited category, and I would be in agreement with you there. But again, there's room to argue the contrary. So again, looking at the health aspects and the risk aspects, maybe they're relatively minimal. In terms of safety, maybe protecting privacy of data, but maybe not as significant. Fundamental rights, maybe not significant again, but something worth considering from a commercial perspective, right? There was one AI incident with Air Canada where essentially they used a chatbot which hallucinated or developed policies that didn't exist on their website. Basically, this went to a tribunal, And what happened is that it ruled in the claimant's favor. So basically what that does is it sets a precedent now for companies to which basically says you are liable for things that come out of your website, as well as also what is generated by your chatbots. So something to be aware of. Let's look at the next case. So this case is about a chatbot to be used for civilians to register 112 emergencies, or just in general health emergencies. Essentially high risk. Again, risk to health, that's going to be quite high, isn't it? Also in terms of safety as well, that could also be quite high, because then we're dealing with quite confidential information. And then fundamental rights, again, we might look to, for example, equal access to public services as a way of help steering us in the direction. But it's really good to see that we're seeing clarity in terms of how these are being classified. So really good to see. Final case, we've got an AI system to assist pilots to land an aircraft. No, great participating, everyone. Great again for sharing your thoughts. So here again, I've classified this as high risk, right? Because again, risk to someone's health, that's going to be quite significant, right? If the landing doesn't go quite right. Safety again, that's maybe on a slightly different aspect, but on cybersecurity as well, yes, it would be an issue if someone was able to hack that system and then change the model's behavior, for instance. Fundamental rights, maybe there's an aspect of human autonomy, again, with the balancing of human versus AI control, of who exactly implements on that decision will be very important to consider. But no, really good, everyone, for participating. I mean, basically, look, I think from what you've got from these 4 cases, you'll see that the justifications will vary, as we've seen from these polls, right? But the most important things to consider are basically making sure that how you classify and justify these risks are consistent across the organization and with your objectives. And then secondly, to cross-check this. So don't be the single person to evaluate the risk. Make sure that this is audited across different stakeholders. So these would be maybe the legal and compliance team. This would also be maybe from end users as well and their perception of it, and also from the technical side of it as well and how they evaluate it, to try and come up with one single level that everyone is happy with. Then again, just to provide some more clarity, because on top of this justification process, hopefully that provides some more clarity, but on top of that, there will be some more guidance that is then provided by the AI office. So this is an organization that is set up by the European Commission to basically help organizations to comply with the EU AI Act. If you're interested in learning more about what the AI office does, there's a link at the bottom of this to follow. So, okay, overall, we hopefully now care about AI legislation, and then we've had a look at the AI risk classifications. We've now got a way of justifying it and figuring out where it's placed. But now we need to ask the question, okay, what do we need to do with these risk levels? So I've mapped them out here on this matrix. And basically for low risk, at the moment, there's no actual specific musts or shalls here. It's basically to follow a voluntary code of conduct that will be published by the AI office. So it'll talk about these points, e.g. environmental sustainability, AI literacy, so making sure that people are aware of the technology and understanding it in more detail, and also accessibility, making sure it's available to a wide range of people. And the EU AI Act text itself actually doesn't have explicit recommendations for minimal and limited risk. It really only focuses on high and prohibited systems, as well as GPAI, which we'll talk about. And so here, it's going to be pretty much similar in terms of following a code of conduct. One of the most important ones is high risk. And so for high risk systems, these would be subject to the following. So having a conformity assessment, having some human oversight mechanism to address any anomalies or changes in model behavior, and also for the models to then be registered in a central EU database. So when we talk about conformity assessment, what does it mean? It basically means an audit. An audit has to go against a certain criteria. And for example, this standard could help with that criteria. So there's a standard that's been published in 2023, apologies, and it's ISO 42001. And basically what it does is it assesses your ability to understand, evaluate, manage, and treat risks, as well as opportunities in the business, and how they align with your organizational objectives. It also has a really strong focus on how you improve on these systems. So it's not about just being prepared for today, but it's being prepared about the risks that will happen in the tomorrows. Finally, after the high risk, we then have unacceptable risks. So these are ones that are just simply just taken off the market completely. So these need to be completely removed. The time frame of when this needs to happen, I'll show you a little bit later on. But for now, let's move on to questions about generative AI. And the EU Act kind of scrambled together towards the last minute about how do we tackle generative AI and its growing popularity. So they came up in chapter 5 with the title of General Purpose AI, which covers the main ideas of basically using a large amount of data to develop models that are hugely general, that can be fine-tuned or repurposed for other tasks. So these obligations are particularly then not on the provider, who then provides technical documentation, which we'll cover in the actionable points, and then a strategy for adversarial testing. So basically making sure that if the model is checking for data poisoning during the training step, or model evasion, which basically happens during the inference stage, whether it is then changing model parameters or hyperparameters, or it's then changing the inference input data itself. So take, for example, if a Tesla is wanting to read a speed sign. So for example, there was a case where if they read a 35, then it will interpret it as 35 miles per hour. But what happens if you cover the tape over the 3 to close it, to make it into an 8? Then it would be interpreted as 85 miles per hour. So that's an example of model evasion, right? To test and make sure that it's working robustly. What they do on top of this as well in terms of GPAI is they add what's called systemic risk. So these are things that basically have a broader spread, higher reaching, and really high intense models. So it's either evaluated or defined in these kind of two pathways. One is about the total amount of computation that's used. So it comes to this number of flops. So there's some exemplar models that are kind of within that scope. And on the right-hand side, it can also be independently evaluated as having systemic risk based on the kind of following criteria. So whether it is to do with the number of model parameters, or its estimated energy consumption, or how much reach it has onto a number of organizations. And so with those systems, we then have the following additional obligations. So we have risk assessment and mitigation. So this could be really helpful, for example, in integrating ISO 42001, which already talks about AI-related risk and risk treatment and mitigation. Adversarial testing in the same way, and also cybersecurity protection is also enabled, again, to make sure that the system is working robustly. Then separately, as a kind of separate tag, they also put in a transparency obligation. And these are only attributed to systems with direct human communication or direct human interaction. So these are things like chatbots. And again, the obligations are labeled towards the right. And a really interesting one is about watermarking, and there's continuing discussion about how this is going to work in practice. So with all those obligations in mind, we put together a little time frame to show kind of where we are. It's come into force already in August. And now the following obligations are going to apply over time. So it's basically, in this slide, it's just a basic say, be aware of when your obligations do come into effect, and be aware of how much time you have as well. You might think 2 years is a long time, but putting in a series of processes in place, especially if you're going to do auditing and conformity assessments, putting in these systems will take time. And we'll need to have evidence as well alongside that. So we now know the risk. We now know the risk obligations. We now know how to classify. We hopefully still care about AI law at this rate. So with this, we're now going to translate it into kind of the juicy aspects of this. So we're going to talk about the actionable steps, the AI pros, right, as promised. And it's broken into really these 3 components. So there's documentation, implementation, and compliance. So we'll break this down a little bit further. Let's have a look at documentation. So here what I've done is I've separated documentation into things that belong into the repository directly and things that are outside of that repository. So I've called those product specification. So if we look into the repository, these are the files that would be a nice idea to put inside. Obviously a README file, the dreaded README file that we always hate filling out, but here's to give kind of furthermore guidance on what exactly to put in for AI projects. So for example, the intended purpose, how is it going to interact with any other software? And what is its user interface? We then have a model card, which basically gives you model metadata. So it gives you an understanding just by reading that XML file. What is the model architecture, the number of parameters, estimated energy consumption. And as you can see, these are feeding into these obligations quite nicely. And then finally, the requirements file, which I think we always do in practice anyway, to just list the versions of software that are then needed to operate the AI system. Then when we talk about product specification, we then have these three documents. So an instructions for use, an acceptable use policy, and post-market surveillance strategy. So with the instructions for use, it's basically a nice little instruction manual to then give to users to then show, okay, what is the system? What is its intended use? What are the strengths? Does it work particularly well for certain groups or certain individuals? What are the risks of then using this system? How is there someone there to monitor this model to make sure it's not going adrift from the behavior that is desired from the organization? Then there's the acceptable use, which then talks about further emphasizing how to properly use the system and make sure that there's a disciplinary process in place to make sure that users are using the technology in line with how you intend it to be, and to make sure that it doesn't affect people's health, safety, and fundamental rights. And then finally, we have the post-market surveillance strategy, which mainly talks about the human oversight angle. So basically, who's responsible to then oversee the model throughout its life cycle? How do we evaluate model drift? And how often shall we do it? And then we have the implementation aspect. So this can be further broken down into either programming or model optimization. So when we talk about programming, I mainly talk about, in this case, logging. So is in chapter 3 in article 12. And basically the logging part is, again, to facilitate human oversight. So to collect certain points in data of when the model is used during inference, to then be able to assess and verify the results and also evaluate model drift. And then for model optimization and evaluation, this is a really interesting one. So this part talks about how do we integrate transparency. So basically, how can we look into a box and understand how inputs are converted into outputs? That aspect, but also on top of that, fairness. So how do we make sure that certain groups are treated fairly across the board? So over here, I'm going to give you a subset of tools to consider. Firstly, for transparency, we have Shapley values. So basically, the whole intuition behind this is to essentially help you to understand how much these features are contributing to the final decision or the final prediction. So we can see with this regression instance, we can see the individual contributions of experience, degree, sales, etc., that lead to the final decision or the final prediction. Another way of integrating transparency is through line. So it's a technique where when we have a very complex model, we basically just zoom in and simplify that decision boundary. So then that way we can understand where that example is placed with respect to the decision boundary. And then in terms of fairness metrics, there's more and more tools out there that can help you to kind of integrate them as metrics into models when training. One resource to look at is a growing library of fairness metrics that are housed in the OECD AI Policy Observatory. Really good resource to check out. And it's a growing piece of work as well from research across the board to help organizations to evaluate fairness. The final point is then to talk about compliance. So here I've split it into passive and active compliance. Now, passive compliance is the start point, is basically where you as an organization start to internally audit the systems that you have, the AI systems that you have, to evaluate against certain AI ethics principles, let's say transparency, privacy, and you're using that as a way of identifying and measuring potential risks, and also developing strategies to then treat those risks or to control for those risks. Then once that system is in place, we can move on to something called active compliance, where here is, instead of having someone in the organization who has an invested interest in the organization, right, so does not want to fully give a complete, honest review of the systems, active compliance acts as a way of adding impartiality from a third-party organization that can then come in, evaluate your systems, and make sure that they're fulfilling the criteria that you set out, and they fulfill, for a certain example, a certain criteria. For example, the ISO 42001. To then basically summarize all the actionable steps, we have the documentation, implementation, and compliance. We have these points now, that's great. Where do they fit in the spectrum of where they go from short to long term? And so hopefully this slide will help to answer a few of those questions. So things like things to do for the repository, or things to do with logging, for instance, or incorporating fairness metrics or transparency into our models. These can be more short-term aspects. Then for midterm, we have more things like product specification and passive compliance, so doing internal audits. And then long-term, when you build that evidence of internal audits, then we can then pursue active compliance. So I've given you an idea of where they kind of fit on the spectrum of where they go from short to long-term, but then where do they sit now in the context of the AI development lifecycle? And basically, I'm going to tell you where it shouldn't be, which is that we shouldn't let compliance just be an afterthought. We shouldn't put, after investing all the resources in designing, collecting the data, training the model, and validating it, then just check it at the end for then it to fall short. The goal is to put all these different aspects of documentation, compliance, etc., as a continuous, responsible AI development cycle that goes around and continues at each of these points as a continuous update across the board. So then finally, to summarize our talk today, basically it comes down to these 4 points. So first, we need to kind of justify where the AI models fit in the risk schema. And that was with our justification framework that we spoke about. And then the next was to then stay up to date with any latest guidance from the AI office to then aid with risk classification and also, more importantly, compliance with the EU AI Act. And then the next point was then about following the obligations via documentation, implementation, and compliance. Those are the kind of 3 mechanisms. I'm sure there's more that I've missed. And then the final point is about the responsible AI development cycle and how it's cyclical across the development life cycle. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Really great to see so much engagement around the topic. Are there any questions?
Had one from Tobias there. In order for an AI system to qualify as unacceptable, would you say that the system needs to break against all factors, health, safety, and fundamental rights, or is it just one?
Really, really good question there. I think from that angle, it's about, again, the justification framework. And it is, I would say, again, the justification process will vary across organizations, right? There's no one-hit wonder. So basically, the reason why we talk about a justification process is to put something in place in your own organization that then you can evaluate. So if someone comes in, a regulator per se, and comes in and says, okay, maybe this system is more high risk, then that way you can have that conversation. So it's just about your interpretation as an organization. But I think to answer that question, hopefully a little bit more specifically than just a hand-wavy term, I would say it's relatively high across all, if not most of the aspects than that we spoke about in the justification framework.
I have one here from another Alexander. If we keep working with the compliance and evaluating the risk with each feature we build, do we need to have that documentation on hand? because someone might knock on the door one day and want to see this, or how will this work?
Yeah, no, and that's a really, really good question. And I think what's nice about this is that it feeds already into how you develop systems, right, through branching. So when we integrate a feature, all it will do in this case is, as I mentioned earlier with the documentation, it's maybe just updating the README file, it's maybe updating the model card. It's all about just then updating those aspects then within the repo, as well as also the product specification. So maybe they're also, maybe for that purpose in terms of version control, they're also housed within the repo. So it's really up to you then how you kind of integrate that in. But I think by having it in a version control approach, as we do with regular development anyway, I think that might be an easier to follow, less annoying thing to do, rather than just then doing it all at once when someone comes knocking at your door, as you say. Hopefully that answers your question there.
I think maybe as well, like, is this something that should we do it to be safe if someone comes to knock on the door, or like what do we do this for, I guess? Maybe the wrong interpretation, but then a question from me.
Yeah, no, and that's also a good question. And hopefully, again, it feeds into improving your code of practice, right? So of course, as developers, we want to generate good code, but at the same time, the code is only as good as our documentation as well, and especially if we pass it into someone else's hands. So I think it's, again, to just stress the importance of documentation.
And one here from Jimmy: if I have a chatbot where the user is sending information about his or her health data, is that considered high risk due to health data, or limited due to the fact that it's only a chatbot?
Yeah, and also a really good question. I think I'd put that question back at you, Jimmy, in terms of evaluating health, safety, fundamental rights, and human versus AI control, right? So even if we were to just evaluate it just from the top of our heads, right, health depends on the context of where that chatbot is then used. Safety, we're then talking about privacy concerns, health data, so relatively high risk. And when we're talking about fundamental rights, worth checking. When it comes to human versus AI control as well, again, who has the decision after the chatbot generates text? It's those things to consider there, Jimmy. So I'm going to put that question hopefully out there to you, and maybe that provides some clarity on that point.
Another question from Willem: who does this well today? Can we as outsiders see this compliance work someone else has done?
Yeah, Willem, really, really good question as well. Who does this well today? And I think the answer is don't know. That question, I think, will only be answered when the obligations start rolling in. So we'll see in 6 months' time where prohibited systems will need to be taken out of the market. So I think hopefully that question will be answered at that point of who does this well. I think, again, question back at you would be how can you be the beacon to then make sure that you are following then the gold standard well with the EU AI Act. There's a few initiatives and a few groups. I think there's the EU AI Pact, I think, which then is a group of organizations that are trying to kind of lead the way in compliance with the EU AI Act. So maybe worth engaging with organizations like that.
If you want to talk more about AI, ML, EU AI Act, we're happy to talk. Feel free to reach out to either Alex or me. There's my email, max@signific. We're happy to discuss both the compliance side, but also what you put into your actual AI development as well. If you want, this is a bit of another topic, but we have another webinar on October 2nd, more about like how you develop experiment platforms. It's in Swedish, quite related as well to machine learning. When you're deploying improvements to your machine learning models in your product, how can you do experiments and test around that in a proper way? Thanks a lot, everyone.
Yeah, no, thank you, everyone.